Welcome to part 6 of the SNA training series. In this short video, we will map the network. Mapping the network is the essence of SNA, and though you do not necessarily have the data to map the network like in the neighborhood social connectivity case, you can still employ the concepts to produce a visual of the system to inform your community group efforts. So now that your community group has identified the purpose of your network and identified strategies, key actors, and types of activities, you can map out the relationships that already likely exist and those that need to be built. Before jumping into mapping the network, there are a few pitfalls to consider. The first pitfall is related to tie strength. In the last part of the series, we discussed that relationships will vary by activity. In addition to varying by activity, relationships will also vary by strength. Think about your own network and how you have many strong ties, such as to family and close friends, as well as many weak ties, like distant family or acquaintances. The pitfall is assuming that only the strong ties are valuable. Strong ties are best for sharing fine-grained or sensitive information and building trust, but weak ties are best for getting new knowledge and ideas and unique resources. In addition, strong ties take more time to develop and maintain, whereas weak ties are easier to maintain. When organizations are working together, like with your community group, it is too much to expect organizations to be able to maintain many strong ties. Instead, ideal is to have a mix of strong and weak ties among the organizations. The image to the right provides an illustration of this mix of strong and weak ties. The thick dark lines depict strong relationships, and the lighter thin lines represent the weak ties. If you take a close look at the yellow J1 and the blue B3, you will notice both these organizations have several strong ties as well as weak ties. This mix of ties contributes important relationships to the overall network, keeping organizations connected through both strong and weak ties, which provide opportunities to work together in ways that require strong relationships, but at the same time can prevent groupthink with the likely different information or resources connected through the weak ties. There are numerous ways to define what we mean by strength of ties. Tie strength can be based on frequency, intensity, or quality. The way to conceptualize tie strength should be linked to activity. For instance, frequency may be the important dimension of strength when it comes to sharing of resources, like the sharing of food in a food access network or with referrals, whereas intensity or quality may matter more for service coordination or joint planning. Another way to think about tie strength is multiplexity, which captures the robustness of relationships. Rather than defining tie strength based on intensity, frequency, or quality, multiplexity defines strength based on the relationship activities. When people or organizations are connected through multiple activities, that tie is usually going to endure even if one activity stops. For instance, if two organizations share information with one another, have a joint grant, and coordinate their referrals, then even when the grant ends, the relationship between those two organizations will likely continue. However, if two organizations only share information with one another, then over time that tie may disappear. In the network map below, the lines are colored differently. The different colors represent the multiplexity of the tie, whether the tie is based on only one activity or multiple activities, 2, 3, or 4. For this particular network, the ties captured were information sharing, resource sharing, coordinated referrals, and service integration. This image is the same network, but I have removed the ties based on only 1 or 2 activities. The blue ties represent relationships based on 3 activities, and the red 4. What we see is that there are much fewer of these stronger, more robust relationships, but at the same time we also see groups of organizations with very robust relationships. The ties that disappeared are likely information or resource sharing ties only. It is important to the system to have many of those, as discussed with the previous slide. But it is also important to have pockets of robust relationships where organizations are working together in multiple ways. A second pitfall is to assume that relationships exist. I have mentioned before that we tend to overassume when it comes to networks, assuming more relationships exist than likely do when it comes to systems. The images below depict the difference between reported ties and confirmed ties. The relationships in the top image on the left are all the relationships that organizations reported they have. The image on the bottom right is the same network, but only the relationships that were reported by both organizations for each tie are depicted, meaning the relationship was confirmed by each organization in the pair. In case this is hard to understand, you can think of this in terms of personal networks and friends. If I reported everyone that I consider a friend, how many of those people would also consider me a friend? There would likely be many of those people that don't reciprocate the notion of me as a friend. In systems, when studying the ties between organizations, usually about 50% of ties are recognized by both sides. There are many reasons that it can explain why ties are not recognized or reported by both sides, but the point is that if both organizations do not recognize a tie, then how valuable is that tie? Can we assume that the relationship exists as it needs to? Often the reasons our systems do not work is because we don't have the relationships necessary to meet the needs. So don't assume that ties exist only because they should exist. A third pitfall is to forget that relationships are dynamic. S&A can provide a snapshot of relationships at one point in time, but relationships will come and go, especially as people come and go. However, even though relationships are people-based, they can be institutionalized or become ingrained in the culture of an organization. If working with other organizations becomes an accepted expectation in an organization, then even when there is turnover, the tie can be maintained through work practices of the organization. Therefore, using S&A to map out the system can help to identify where there may be ties that are important to the system, and thus ensuring those ties are supported and institutionalized. In the image to the right, watch the hole that emerges as the yellow diamond U1 and its ties disappear. Though it is unlikely that an organization will completely disappear, it is not so uncommon for a change in agency leadership or direction to result in a change to how that agency works with other agencies. In this particular example, U1 did experience a change that resulted in it no longer engaging in the same way with other organizations as it did before. So what is important to remember is that though the right relationships may exist at one point, this does not mean that those relationships will endure over time, and the S&A maps can help identify where it may be important to work to build ties or institutionalize them to create a more resilient system. Now that we have discussed a few pitfalls to avoid, it is your turn to map the system that is the focus of your community group network. In groups, and in considering the identified purpose and strategy in your list from the relationship activity exercise, answer the following questions. Which relationships already exist? Draw lines between the key actors. You may want to consider using different shapes to identify the groups of different actors, much as I have done in the examples I have provided: funders, schools, hospitals, public agencies, businesses, whatever categories make sense for your group. Be specific with your relationships. Consider activity of relationships and use different colors for different activities. Also consider strength of tie, drawing solid lines for strong and dotted lines for weak. After mapping the relationships that exist, identify which relationships do not exist but should. Use a different color to draw these lines. Make note of whether these ties should be strong or weak, and whether they should be specific to certain types of relationship activities. In the neighborhood social connectivity case example, data on relationships was captured through a pre-workshop survey. I provide details of how to do the same in an appendix video, but the mapping exercise can also provide you with a starting image that may be enough for your community group to identify next steps. For this case, we asked workshop participants to indicate the relationships they had based on 3 activities. Information sharing, which was described in this way: sharing information with one another may be important to addressing the needs in the neighborhood, whether that be social inclusion or another identified need. Please select the organizations with whom your organization shares information concerning the needs of neighborhood residents. Advocacy, described as advocacy on behalf of neighborhood, may be necessary to ensure awareness of the needs of the residents. Please select the organizations with whom your organization currently coordinates to advocate on neighborhood's behalf. And coordination, described as meeting the needs of neighborhood residents, may require unique service or program strategies. Please select the organizations with whom your organization currently coordinates to better serve neighborhood. Below is a network plot of the information sharing ties for the neighborhood social connectivity case. Please note that for workshop participants, the labels for each square identified the specific organization, but the labels have been anonymized for use in these videos. However, the color does indicate the broad category of each organization. Red represents schools, yellow government agencies, green community organizations, and blue coalitions or associations. Also, the bigger the square, the higher number of ties. In the next part of the series, we will discuss interpreting network maps, but for now, let me point out that all the organizations are connected, and there are connections between the groups of actors, and certain organizations, like AA12, are really well connected. This image depicts the advocacy relationships. Key to notice for now is that there are fewer relationships overall, and some organizations do not have advocacy ties. They are therefore lined up in the far left corner. In this image, we also see more clustering by color, meaning more ties between similar actors than across. The final network plot is of the coordination relationships. There are 3 organizations without any coordination ties, and an interesting structure with a number of ties between the group on the right side, whereas the organizations outside of that group are connected for the most part only to AA12. We have created some interesting images, but what do we do with these images? In the next video, we will discuss how to interpret the network plots and how to use them to identify next steps.